All right, good morning, students. Let's take a look at this chapter 11 homework. And I'll remind you again to click here to get that point. Let's look at these questions over here. Okay, so an internet company conducts a global consumer survey to help multinational companies understand different consumer attitudes throughout the world. Within 30 countries, the researchers interview 1,000 people aged 13 to 65. Their samples are designed so they get 500 males and 500 females in each country. So are they using a simple random sample? No, it would be nearly impossible to get exactly 500 males and 500 females from every country by random chance. I have to plan that out. So I've got to use a different sampling technique, one that divides people by their gender in order for me to get an answer like that, right? It's not simple random sampling. So what kind of design do we think that they are using? Well, they must have stratified by whether the respondent is male or female in order to get 500 of each. It's not systematic. Systematic is where you sample multiple people. Systematic is where you sample this, like every fifth person or something like that. Now right here I see it says multi-stage. Now it does say 500 males and females in each country. So I may need to combine the stratified with a cluster where the cluster is representative of the country. So it might be a multi-stage sample. Okay, I guess it's straight out stratified then. All right, a website asked as their question of the day to which visitors the site were invited to respond. Do you ever use emoticons when you type online? Of the 87,782 respondents, 23% said they did not use emoticons. All right, a website is asking their visitors. That's just a convenience sample. They're not doing any kind of random sampling or dividing people up in any way. How much confidence are we going to place in a random, in a convenience sample? Almost none. Now, it has nothing to do with the sample size. It has the fact to do that it is a convenience sample. And we know that's not representative of the population. At its website, a polling company publishes results of a new survey each day. Scroll down to the end of the published results and find the statement that includes the words shown below. Results are based on telephone interviews with 1,008 national adults age 18 and older conducted April 2 through 5, 2007. In addition to sampling error, question wording, and practical difficulties in conducting surveys can introduce error or bias in findings of public opinion polls. For this survey, identify the population of interest. So the results were done with telephone interviews of these 1,008 adults. So we're trying to generalize to everyone in the nation that is age 18 or older, but we can't really generalize to that population because we're doing it by phone, as I'm sure the next question will help us see. The company performs its surveys by phoning numbers generated by a random computer program. What is the sampling frame? Everyone with a telephone is our sampling frame. What problems, if any, would you be concerned about in matching the sample with the population? Some people do not have telephones because not everybody over 18 has a telephone that can be generated through random sampling, right? For the following report about a statistical study, identify, if possible, the population parameter of interest, the sampling frame, the sample, the sampling method. Include whether or not randomization was employed, who, if anyone, was left out of the study, any potential sources of bias. Researchers waited outside a bar they had randomly selected from a list of such establishment, stopped every 20th adult who came out of the bar, and asked whether she thought drinking and driving was a serious problem. What's our population? All adults who would visit a bar, right? Because we're looking at, we're only generating people who are, or our sampling is done from a population of people going to a bar. It's not all people in general. If we're using the sampling frame of random bars and we picked one of them, then our population would be anyone who would go to a bar. What is the population parameter of interest? Adults who think drinking and driving is a serious problem is what we're trying to measure. What is the sampling frame? So our sampling frame is the bars. Well, it says we selected one bar from a list of such establishments. So it's not all bars, all adults who drink, patrons from the chosen bar. It's going to be our closest answer there. Yeah. What is the sample for this study? The sample is every 20th adult leaving the bar, the one that we got. What sampling method was used? That's systematic, where you do like every 20th person. Is the sampling method used random? Well, yeah, if you're sampling every 20th person, that is random sampling. It's just not necessarily representative of the population, as we'll see right here, who was left out of this study. Any adults who left bars other than the chosen one. And any adults who would not go to a bar. Yeah, actually, both of those are correct, but that's the most correct, is any adults who would not go to a bar. What type of bias is evident in this sample? Well, the undercoverage and response bias, because we're not sampling from a correct population here if we're only targeting the one bar. What problems can you see in generalizing to the population of interest? Adults leaving a bar may think drinking and driving is less of a problem than other adults. They're walking out intoxicated. A local TV station conducted a pulse poll about the upcoming mayoral election. Evening news viewers were invited to text in their votes, with the results being announced on the late night news. Based on the text, the station predicted that the current mayor would win the election with 52% of the vote. They were wrong, and the mayor lost, getting only 46% of the vote. Do you think the station's faulty prediction is more likely to be a result of bias or sampling error? All right. The evening viewers were invited to text in their votes. So this is a voluntary response. Bias. Once people watch, only people watching the news will respond, and their preference may differ from that of other voters. So it's not representative of the population of interest. In a large city school system with 23 elementary schools, the school board is considering the adoption of a new policy that would require elementary students to pass a test in order to be promoted to the next grade. The PTA wants to find out whether parents agree with this plan. Listed below are some of the ideas proposed for gathering data. For each, indicate what kind of sampling strategy is involved and what, if any, biases might result. All right. What kind of sampling strategy is involved? If we randomly select one of the neighborhoods and contact the parents of every student, that is a cluster because you have one grouping and you're contacting everybody in that group. That's a cluster. What kind of bias? So the parents that they sample from that one neighborhood may not be representative of all parents. Now, if we were to list the names of all the students alphabetically and contact the parent of every 20th student, that would be simple, systematic sampling. Only if it's not just, because that should be relative, that should produce a relatively random sample. Send a survey home with every student and ask parents to fill it out and return it the next day. This would be an attempt at a census because you're sending it home with every student, so you're trying to contact everyone. Voluntary response bias, only parents who feel strongly about the issue will respond. Oh, I'm sorry. Non-response bias, since not all parents will respond. Ask the parents for their opinions when they visit the PTA booth during parent-teacher conferences. That's convenience. Because they're walking up to you. You're not going out and like identifying people. What kinds of bias? Only parents who feel strongly about it will respond. There's our voluntary response bias. Oh. Oh, sorry, I didn't read low enough. Under coverage bias. Again, if it's a convenient sample, it's not going to be representative of the population. Cut. B. Only parents involved with PTA. Oh, I didn't read that it was a PTA booth. My mistake. Okay, so yes, in this case, well, that's true, but it is also the case that parents in the sample wouldn't be representative of everybody since they're voluntarily picking. Only the people who feel strongly will probably respond to that. All right. An amusement park has opened a new roller coaster. It is so popular that people are waiting up to 3 hours for a 2-minute ride. Concerned about how patrons who paid a large amount to enter the park and ride on the bus feel about this, they surveyed 200 consecutive people as they exit the park, starting from a randomly selected the individual. What kind of sample is this? This would be, well, they randomly selected the individual and then surveyed 200 consecutive people. So we would count that as a random sample. No? It's not systematic. It's not a census. So it'd have to be a convenient sample because we did the consecutive people. Yeah, we didn't mix people up in any way. So we're just grabbing the people that come through. Okay, that would be a convenient sample. What is the sampling frame? The patrons of the park are the ones who had the possibility of being asked as they left. Is it likely to be representative of the population of interest? We're concerned about the patrons of the park. So it's not likely to be representative of everyone who waited in line for the roller coaster, though. So I guess more generally, we can say not representative of everyone in the park. What members of the population of interest are omitted? Patrons who exit the park at a different time, right? Because we sampled everybody at one time. 2 members of the PTA committee have proposed the accompanying questions to ask in seeking parents' opinions. Question 1 is, should elementary school age children have to pass high-stake tests in order to remain with their classmates? And question 2 is, should schools and students be held accountable for meeting yearly learning goals by testing students before they advance to the next grade? All right, notice the first question says the children have to pass high-stake tests. And the second question said students should be held accountable for meeting yearly learning goals. Question 1 will probably get many no because of that phrasing of the high stake. But question 2 will get many yeses because of that phrasing of be held accountable. Propose a question with more neutral wording that might better assess parental opinion. All right, notice this is held back for below average scores. That's kind of biased a little bit. Talking about students' intelligence. Now here we go. This is neutral language. Do you think standardized tests are appropriate for deciding whether a student should be promoted to the next grade? Of capable of handling the material taught, that's kind of biased wording. So we're going to go with C. All right, we're looking for bias. Should companies that promote teen smoking be liable to help pay for the cost of cancer institutions? Promote teen smoking. So the question is biased because of that wording of we're going to promote teen smoking. Given that 16-year-olds are old enough to drive, is it fair to set the gambling age at 18? The question is biased towards no because of the preamble, 16-year-olds are old enough to drive. You're setting them up. If they're old enough to drive, then they're old enough to gamble. If you create an online survey, individuals can choose on their own whether to participate in the sample. This causes a form of bias called voluntary response. When you sample so that every combination of individuals in your population has an equal chance of being chosen, you are taking a simple random sample. A friend of yours in your intro stats class obtains permission to randomly sample the university student body to conduct a satisfaction survey on some recent changes to the enrollment process. She randomly samples 50 freshmen, 50 sophomores, 50 juniors, and 50 seniors. This is an example of, notice that they're in different classes here. That's stratified. All right, guys, you are done with this homework. Please contact me if you have any questions about this material.